There's a moment in every courtroom, not when someone speaks, but when someone refuses to answer, and the silence tells you more than any confession ever could. Because what you are about to see is not a misunderstanding, not a policy disagreement, not even a political clash in the usual sense. This is what it looks like when a simple yes or no question becomes impossible to answer. And the real question is not what Kash Patel said in that room. It's why he couldn't just say it. Why does a man in charge of the nation's most powerful investigative agency struggle with the simplest form of truth? This is not a normal oversight hearing. This is a stress test of credibility, conducted in public, under oath, with the weight of the Constitution quietly sitting in the background while everyone pretends it's just another day in Washington. And from the very first exchange, Cory Booker makes it clear he's not here to play along. No speeches, no polite detours, no carefully packaged talking points, just a direct line of questioning that cuts straight to the core. Did you discuss removing FBI personnel with the White House before your confirmation? Yes or no? Now, in any normal setting, that question lands, gets answered, and the conversation moves on. But this isn't a normal setting, and what follows immediately changes the temperature of the room. Because instead of a clean answer, Patel shifts, slightly at first, almost imperceptibly, toward language that sounds like an answer, but isn't one. He talks about standards, about people not meeting the mark, about hypothetical future decisions, carefully circling the question without stepping into it. And Booker doesn't let it go, because this is the moment he's been building toward, the moment where repetition stops being redundancy and starts becoming pressure. So he asks again, and then reframes it so tightly there's nowhere left to hide. And that's when the pattern becomes visible. Question, deflection, follow-up, reframing, no denial, no confirmation, just movement. Then Booker sharpens the blade. He brings in prior testimony, the grand jury, the claim that statements were already public, except they weren't. He cites the court ruling, points directly to Rule 6, removes every procedural shield that could justify silence, and reduces the entire exchange to one unavoidable reality. You are allowed to answer, you know the answer, and yet you are choosing not to give it. At that point, this stops being about documents or conversations. It becomes about something much more uncomfortable. Because when a witness challenges the premise instead of answering the question, what they are really doing is negotiating with reality in real time. And Booker sees it, calls it out, names it for what it is, a mockery of the process. But here's where it gets more serious, because this isn't just about what was said in a grand jury or who spoke to whom before a confirmation hearing. This is about whether decisions inside the FBI, the institution that is supposed to operate above politics, are being influenced by something far more personal than the law. And once that door opens, once the question shifts from, "What did you say?" to, "Who are you answering to?" the entire hearing stops being procedural and starts becoming structural. Because Cory Booker doesn't pivot away. He leans in, harder, faster, more precise, and he introduces a new variable that changes everything. Stephen Miller. Not as a side detail, not as background noise, but as a direct line of influence into an agency that is supposed to be insulated from exactly that kind of contact. How often do you speak with him? Frequently. That word lands heavier than any accusation because it doesn't need interpretation. It doesn't need context. It doesn't need analysis. If the FBI operates independently, then frequency itself becomes the problem. And Booker doesn't rush past it. He slows down, deliberately, almost clinically, forcing the implication to sit in the room long enough for everyone to process what it actually means. You don't just talk frequently to a political advisor without those conversations bleeding into decisions, priorities, and outcomes. You don't maintain that level of contact and still claim a clean separation between law enforcement and politics without explaining how that separation is protected. And Patel doesn't explain it. Instead, he reframes again. Homeland Security Task Forces, interagency cooperation, operational value, all technically valid, all strategically irrelevant to the question being asked. Because the real question is not whether those conversations exist. He already admitted they do. The real question is whether those conversations influence who gets removed, who gets reassigned, and who gets protected. And this is where Booker begins stacking evidence, not emotionally, not rhetorically, but structurally, one piece at a time until the weight becomes impossible to ignore. A lawsuit filed by FBI officials, allegations of retaliation tied to political loyalty, a named agent, Brian Driscoll, 20 years of service, decorated, respected, removed. A termination letter dated October 8, 2025, citing Article 2 of the Constitution as justification. And then the quiet but devastating question, "You're not the president. So where did that authority come from?" That's not a political attack. That's a legal challenge. And Patel's response, "It's under litigation," is not just a refusal. It's a retreat into a safe zone where accountability is delayed, not denied, but effectively out of reach in the moment that matters most. And Booker doesn't chase him into that legal fog. He pivots again, faster now, sharper, because the pattern is clear and the strategy has shifted. If you can't get an answer on authority, you expose the consequences of its use. And that's when the hearing stops being about one firing and starts becoming about an entire system under strain. And once the focus shifts from one decision to the system behind it, the scale of the problem becomes impossible to contain inside a single exchange. Because Cory Booker doesn't argue in hypotheticals, he starts laying out numbers, roles, functions, the actual machinery of the FBI, piece by piece, showing not what might happen, but what is already happening in real time. 20% of agents reassigned. Entire task forces redirected. Investigations into human trafficking, counterintelligence, public corruption, interrupted, diluted, or outright abandoned. And then he does something strategically devastating. He takes those numbers out of the abstract and places them into reality. Agents who track predators, reassigned. Agents who follow money trails tied to foreign influence, reassigned. Agents who build cases over years, sometimes decades, pulled out midstream and told to do something else entirely. This is not reorganization. This is displacement. And when Patel pushes back, talking about seized weapons, numbers of arrests, metrics that sound impressive on paper, it doesn't cancel the point, it reinforces it. Because metrics don't answer the question of what is no longer being done. They don't explain which investigations were paused, which threats are no longer being monitored, which victims are no longer being prioritized. And Booker sees the gap and drives straight through it. You're not denying it. You're not correcting it. You're not even directly addressing it. You're just moving around it. That repetition is no longer about persistence. It becomes evidence in itself. Because when the same question produces the same avoidance pattern over and over again, the avoidance becomes the answer. And then comes the number that changes the emotional gravity of the room. 14 years. That's not a statistic. That's a timeline. 14 years to rebuild staffing. 14 years to recover experience. 14 years to restore something that was not just reduced, but fundamentally disrupted. In law enforcement terms, that's not a setback. That's a generational gap. And Booker doesn't let it sit quietly. He frames it for what it actually means. Mentorship disappears. Institutional memory evaporates. The kind of judgment that only comes from decades in the field simply vanishes overnight. And what replaces it is not experience but absence. And at that point, this stops being a disagreement about leadership style. It becomes a question of risk. Because if the people who know how to detect threats are no longer in position to do so, then the threats don't disappear, they just go unseen. And that is the point where this hearing stops being about policy, stops being about personalities, and becomes something far more uncomfortable to admit out loud. Because what Cory Booker is really saying, without softening it, without dressing it up, is simple and brutal. You are not just making decisions, you are changing the level of safety for every person outside that room. Not in theory, not someday. Right now, and the contrast couldn't be clearer. On one side, a director with authority, access, and the power to reshape priorities. On the other side, people who will never hear this hearing, never read a transcript, never know why a case stopped moving, why an agent disappeared from an investigation, why a lead went cold. That's the moral fracture line. Because when agents who investigate crimes against children are reassigned, when teams tracking organized crime or foreign interference are broken apart, the consequences don't show up in a hearing room. They show up in missed warnings, in delayed responses, in victims who never get answers. And Booker doesn't soften it. He says it directly. You are making this country weaker. You are making it less safe. Not as an opinion, as a conclusion drawn from everything that came before, every avoided answer, every deflection, every number that was confirmed, and every number that was never denied. And then he delivers something even sharper than accusation, a prediction that Kash Patel may not even last in this role, not because of political opposition, but because the very system he appears to align with has never shown loyalty to individuals, only to outcomes. That line lands differently because it's no longer about accountability. It's about inevitability. And yet, even at that point, Booker doesn't end with anger. He ends with something more unsettling. He says he prays, not for victory, not for political advantage, but for Patel to remember the oath, to defend the Constitution, to do the job the way it was meant to be done. And that's the final shift. Because this was never just about one hearing. It's about whether the rules still mean the same thing when they are inconvenient, whether yes or no still matters when the answer carries consequences, whether an institution designed to be independent can stay that way under pressure. So here is the question that doesn't go away when the cameras turn off. If the people trusted to enforce the law can choose when to answer and when to evade, then what exactly is left of accountability? And more importantly, who decides? If you think moments like this matter, if you think answers should still mean something, then don't just watch. Engage. Like the video, leave your perspective in the comments, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe for more breakdowns that don't stop at the surface.